Hello, Richard, and welcome to Bring Your Own Bold. How are you, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. Looking forward to it.
Good. So, just for a bit of context, many of you will know Richard as the author of The Choice Factory, one of the few books I think that genuinely changed how marketers think about behaviour. And it's actually always one of my recommended reads and takes pride on my bookshelf, you'll be pleased to hear.
Let's stop it
Um,
now. It's only going to go downhill after this. Yeah, yeah.
Done. Yeah, and for me, what's great about it is I think that you make the work of behavioural science feel usable rather than purely academic, which is a big reason why we wanted to get you on today to talk
Good.
about it. So taking the theory to actual usage in it.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that was definitely an aim. I got quite frustrated. Look, you read the academic papers, and they are often just stuff full of jargon and unnecessary statistics,
Mm.
and it seems such a waste that this work is, hidden away in university libraries, not being used by marketers every single day. So I really wanted to simplify it and make it really easy to apply. So I'm glad
Yeah.
that came through.
Love it. So in B2B today, like a lot of our audience will be aware of some of the basic principles in play. So, a bit of social proof, scarcity, maybe a nudge here and there. But I think often it either stops at a surface level or there needs to be a deep or could be a deeper consideration in terms of how it could be used. So today we're going to go into things a little bit deeper and we're going to unpack a framework as well, which you recommend called EAST, which gives people a bit more of a structured way to apply behavioural science, and we'll talk about how it plays out in the real world, as you say, actual usage rather than purely theory. So let's get into it. So for those people who aren't fully aware, let's start with a bit of the basics. How do you explain behavioural science, and why should marketers in B2B care about it?
Yeah, well, I think they should care about it because they are in the business of behaviour change. Whatever B2C, B2B, whatever industry you're in, you're basically in the business of changing people's behaviour. You want to get people to pay more for your product, to switch from competitor brands, buy more of your products. So what could be more relevant than the study of what makes for effective behaviour change? So to
Mm.
me, it feels almost ludicrous that we don't, as an industry, use this field more often. Behavioural science is just the study of what effectively changes behaviour, and it's what actually changes behaviour rather than what people claim changes their behaviour, and they're often very, very different things.
I'm sure we'll get into bits. I mean, before the session, we've had a couple of discussions, and it was quite interesting. We were reflecting on the fact from a B2B point of view that people sometimes feel that behavioural science is potentially a bit more of a consumer thing. Like, does it apply to us when we walk into the workplace? Which I always find a little bit odd because we're not exactly walking calculators and you park up and you change personality as soon as you step through the door or open your laptop.
Yeah, and I'd agree with your logic. And on top of that logic, there's also an awful lot of experimentation that backs that up. I would say the general theme is most biases that have been found to work on consumers work well on professionals. So
Mm-hmm.
there's reams of evidence, as you mentioned earlier, about social proof. And I think a lot of marketers use that principle, which is the idea that if you make something popular, it will become more popular still. But that evidence isn't limited to people in supermarkets and pubs. It's shown on teachers, on farmers, on B2B decision makers, on doctors. Again and again and again, professionals are shown to be just as influenced by these biases as customers. So yeah, I think that is one of the myths that probably needs to be busted.
Yeah, definitely agree with it. Um, So should we get into the framework then? So we talk about structures. So you talk about these framework as a way to is it apply behavioural science better?
I think so. So the East framework is something created by the Behavioural Insights team. So this is
Mm-hmm.
what often people will have hear. They call the nudge unit often. It's the government's essential behavioural science arm. And back in 2014, they did this amazing job of distilling behavioural science down into four key principles. So EAST is an acronym and it stands for E, make it easy, A, make it attractive, S, make it social, and T, make it timely. And essentially, these are the four key principles of behavioural science. Now, within each principle, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of experiments. But I think a simple framework like EAST is really useful in turning behavioural science into a practical tool because it acts as an aid memoir. If you ever have a challenge, you think of those four key principles, you think of the associated experiments, and then you use those experiments as a stimulus to come up with ideas. And if you do that, any solution that you generate for your challenge, because it's based on a sound psychological insight, it's going to be more effective. You're stacking the odds in your favour.
Yeah, I like that. I really like that. Making it more, it breaks it down, makes it, makes it something where you can use a bit of thinking and apply it, and it gives you a bit of something to work with. It's a nice tool to be able to start playing around with some of these concepts and being able to actually apply it.
Absolutely, and there are other frameworks out there: Mindspace, Cialdini's Six Principles, Fogg's model, Combi. The thing that I love about East is it's simple. And I think if you want your organisation to adopt these practices, start with a very simple framework. I think Combi has about 17 moving parts, and I've always found if you try and run a workshop or solve a problem using that, unless the people you're dealing with are behavioural science specialists, you spend more time talking about the framework than the problem. That's a problem that you don't get with East. It's wonderfully simple.
Yeah, that's bang on. I mean, doing a lot of, working in brand a lot myself, there's a hell of a lot of frameworks out there. And I think one of the common frustrations that I always get annoyed about is it's sometimes like the over-reliance on frameworks of like, you get too obsessed with the framework as opposed to what you're trying to do. So definitely the more simple in terms of that and usable it is, the better.
Yeah, and I think that idea of the kind of, they are important, but they're not that important in the way I think about it is you've had thousands upon thousands of psychologists running experiments. There's this huge body of research. All the framework's doing really is categorizing that research and making it easier to apply. So East or Mindspace, they just cut up into different principles the same body of work. So really, I think in many ways, it's not absolutely crucial which one you use. It's just which works best for you. And from my opinion, I think I'd prioritise simplicity over most other values.
Yeah, definitely. So should we get into it then?
Yes,
Start unpacking it a bit then. So first up, we might as well start at the beginning of it, East. So make it easy. So can you just, beyond, what it says on the tin, is there anything else to...
Yeah. So this one, I think it suffers from sounding like a statement of the obvious, but it's a little bit more than just saying, if you want to encourage a behaviour, make it easier. I think that, everyone knows. The kind of key point here is we repeatedly, as people, underestimate the importance of removing friction. So there's a lovely commonality between the last two Nobel laureates for, the last two behavioural scientists who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. So Thaler in 2017 and Kahneman in 2002. And both of them have or had very, very long, illustrious careers. But both of them, when they're asked, what is the single most important thing you've learned from all your studies? They both say the same thing, make it easy. And their argument is it's not just that removing friction has an impact on behaviour. It tends to have an outsized effect. People tend to overestimate the importance of boosting motivation, and they tend to underestimate the importance of making something easy. So what tends to happen in most organizations is if they've done a cost benefit analysis and they've had this misunderstanding of the scale of friction, they will have left in their processes an awful lot of barriers that if they removed would have a larger than expected effect. So the recommendation for marketers is essentially go through your customer journey, identify even the most trivial little barrier, and then put more efforts into resolve it. So, yes, a little bit kind of does what it says on the tin, but it's that point about the discrepancy between what we think and what's the truth. This underestimation.
Yeah. I think and a really interesting tension, I think, within this area, we talked about before, is the illusion of effort. And I think one thing I found really fascinating about this is a recent collaboration you did called The S Advantage, and particularly on AI specifically and how it disrupted the illusion of effort. So can we just go into that?
Yeah. So the broad principle of make it easy is start by making the customer journey as simple as possible. So let's make it easy for your customers. However, just because customers want things to be easy for themselves, it doesn't mean that they want things to have been easy for you as a brand. And the original work was done by Andrea Morales, who's at the University of Southern California. And for her study, she recruits a group of people. They're all in market for a house. and she shows them a list of 10 houses that an estate agent's pulled together. And all of these houses meet the requirement of the participant. The only difference is some people get a tail of the estate agent going to loads of effort to generate this list. They did it manually, and it took 9 hours. The other half of people are told the estate agent used a computer and it only took an hour to generate the list. Now, apart from that story of effort, everyone gets exactly the same list of houses. But when those participants are asked to rate the quality of the service of the estate agent, you see this wildly different pattern. The people who think a little effort went into the service, they rate it at 50 out of 100. The people who think lots of effort went into it, they rate it at 68 out of 100. So it's this 36% swing in behaviour. Now, all Transmission and Utinex and I did for this report was we essentially reran a variant of Morales' study, but we ran it amongst B2B buyers in a B2B setting, and we saw exactly the same impact. What's happening here is in complex situations, people often replace the complex question with a simpler alternative that gives them an almost as good answer. And working out the quality of the service provision is a complex question. So instead of asking that question, people think to themselves, how much effort do I think the provider went to? They essentially use effort as a proxy for quality. So as a brand, what you need to be doing is thinking, how can I be as transparent as possible about all the effort that has gone into the creation of my product? The same product will be rated very, very differently dependent on whether people think lots of effort's gone into it. So you need to make those stories of effort as salient as possible.
Yeah, I think that's quite thought provoking. That's interesting, particularly in B2B as well, because you think we're basically operating in a world where speed, automation, simplicity, and everything is celebrated within it, and as you say, like trying to reduce these friction points. So in a sense, like on certain things, you can almost devalue your own work by making it look too easy in that sense in certain applications.
Yeah, let's imagine you are a media agency. That's where I started my career, and one of the things you do for a brand is you create competitor analysis reports.
Mm-hmm.
If you adopt AI and those reports that there used to be a 7-day lead time are now given out in 30 minutes, even if the content is exactly the same, there is an argument, because of the illusion of effort potentially, that your client will begin to value them less. Now, that's not speculation. There's already some research into AI and the illusion of effort. The original experiment was done by Kobe Millet. So he's at VR University in Amsterdam. And very simple study, shows people posters, and sometimes those posters are labelled as AI generated, sometimes they're labelled as hand drawn. And on all sorts of different metrics, he sees very different scores. So for example, for purchase intent, if people think it was generated by AI, they rate it at 3.02 out of 7. If they think it was hand drawn, they rate it at 4.85 out of 7. So you've got this 61% difference in purchase intent based on whether someone thinks that product was created by AI or hand drawn. And you see similar swings in those scores for things like artistic appreciation and creativity. And Millet's argument is this is an example of the illusion of effort. We assume, because of our experience with things like ChatGPT, it spits out a blog post in 2 seconds. We assume AI equals low effort, and therefore exactly the same product will be labelled or will be interpreted as lower value, unless you go to kind of counterbalancing approaches, unless you try and stymie that.
Yeah, I was going to say. So, I mean, we're in a world where AI is going to be, whether we like it or not, it's going to play, and it's going to play a more prevalent part in our lives. So, like, what are ways that you could signal more human effort within that? Because I think a lot of the time, the output of AI is often celebrated quite a lot in terms of we proudly created this with the AI in that sense. So how do you balance?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. This isn't a kind of Luddite approach of you've got to ignore AI. I mean, that would be ridiculous. All it's saying is exactly the same output. If you speed up the process, tends to get rated lower. So if you're in a case where you are creating work more quickly via AI, what you need to do is draw attention to the efforts that went into the setting up of the systems rather than the speed of the results. And actually, there's people have realised this, I think, for a long time, and the best communicators have always tried to do this. So often with these things, maybe an anecdote or an example is the best way of explaining it. There is a famous example from the 1990s where City Group and I think Travellers merged. They've got this giant financial behemoth coming together as Citibank, and they had hired amazing designer Paula Scher to come up with a new logo and her agency. And they'd given her a huge budget, $1.5 million to design this logo. And what happens is in the initial briefing meeting, while they are telling Paula Scher and her team about the kind of issues of the brand and what they're aiming for, as she's doing it, she starts sketching out a logo. And she does it on a napkin, you can find pictures of that napkin on the internet, and it is basically exactly the same as the logo they currently have. Now, when it came to them presenting the bill for $1.5 million, the client was a little bit, well, you sketched this out in 30 seconds. How the hell are you expecting us to pay $1.5 million? And Paula Scher's supposed answer has gone down in legend. She said, it took me, yes, I drew it in 30 seconds, but it took me 34 years to learn how to draw it in 30 seconds. She is switching the conversation to the speed of the production, to the length of time it took through experience to get to the state that you could knock that out so quickly. So I think that's the analogy people should have in their mind. You've got to bring people's recognition back to the time and effort you've put into setting up the protocols and the systems and getting a really experienced team that you can now fire out these reports or pieces of work very quickly.
I love that. There's a lot of stuff in terms of how you frame perception of value on a lot of things, isn't there?
Yeah, some argue, Dan Ariely argues it comes back to fairness, that, we have this kind of rule of thumb in our mind that, the longer someone works at something, the more they should be paid. And what you generally find is if you transgress these internal biases people have, you are trying to, push water uphill, essentially. It's better to work with these biases rather than against them.
Yeah, definitely. And it works a number of different ways, doesn't it? Like, as you said, you don't want someone to be taking ages over something. And there's that balance, isn't there, to where like time is perceived as a good thing, or you've put in a lot of work on this versus speed. It maybe devalues it, but then, as you say, speed is actually using your experience and it's allowing you to get to an end result quicker. Then 100%, that's amazing. Yeah. That's good, and that is massively valuable.
Yes, and I think it's around shifting the focus of the conversation. The main finding from all these studies is the same thing will be valued less if the audience think limited work's gone into it. So you've got to think as a communicator, what is the honest area that I can focus on that will emphasize the scale of the effort? The classic one is Dyson. How you probably logically should judge the quality of a vacuum is on its sucking power, its design, all sorts. But of course, the illusion of effort suggests that might be what people should do, but it's not how they actually behave. So Dyson tap into the illusion of effort brilliantly. They always talk about the 5,127 prototypes they went through. It's that emphasis of effort and time that people assume leads to a higher quality product.
Yeah, very powerful. So should we move on to attractive then? So making everything attractive.
Yeah, and this one's a very broad area. So I think there are thousands of different ways you can make something more attractive. But the one that I thought might be of interest, because again with transmission I've done a bit of work around this working in a B2B context, is the idea of precision. So classic study comes from Schindler at Rutgers University, and he argues that precise numbers are treated as more accurate and credible than rounded numbers. So simple study, shows people ads for a deodorant, and sometimes there is a claim that deodorant reduces perspiration by 50%, a suspiciously round number. Other people sometimes see that ad with the claim being 47 or 53%. And what Schindler finds is that the group that see the precise number, they rate the accuracy of the statement at plus 10%, the credibility of the claim at plus 5%. So what he's showing is if there is a suspicion of round numbers. If you make a kind of vague claim, we've got 1 million customers, we'll speed up your processes by 10%, people are suspicious. It feels like you've plucked that number out of the air. But if you add a degree of precision in, then it becomes more believable.
That's interesting. Actually, it randomly reminds me of buying my house, and now obviously this is relevant as well. I read a book called The Art of Negotiation and thought I'd try applying some of it as I went through the process. And it was on again, put in an exact number within it. So when you're putting in a bid, don't put in a rounded number. It was saying put in a XXX8750 or something like that. And it would say it gives the illusion of you have considered it really hard. You've taken into account a lot of things and you arrived at a really specific area. So therefore, that is more powerful than just a rounded number.
Yeah, absolutely. So in negotiations, Chris Voss, who's written Never Split the Difference, he says what tends to happen with a precise response, like let's say, as you say, ask for £10,750. If you get a counter offer, it tends to be much closer to the original offer than if you just said £10,000 or £20,000. So I think that there's certainly arguments from negotiation professionals that works very well. There's also behavioural science experiment that people assume precise prices are lower. There's a lovely Uber study, as in the brand, not a giant study, where they have a behavioural science team, and what they showed was that if you offered someone a 2x search price, 2x, they were less likely to take that ride than a 2.1x search price. So people have over time generated this assumption that round prices are marked up more. And that Uber study is almost the gold standard, I think, of studies, because it's done on a representative audience who don't know they're taking part in an experiment. We have probably been in one of these Uber studies. And if you don't know you're in an experiment, you can't change your behaviour. So you can give that finding a much greater degree of credibility.
So where can you give us some examples of where this could be applied in a B2B setting then?
Yeah, I think for that. So the study I did with Transmission, we created ads where we create this fictitious cybersecurity brand called Cryptex, and we talked about the fact that they delivered a 40% reduction in threats. Now, when we asked people how believable that was, I think the average response was like 38% believing it. When we changed that number to be either 39.6 or 40.4% to another group of people, the believability and the trust in that number went up to 49%. So you've got this 29% improvement. Yeah. So that is an example. People think about your business. You make all sorts of claims about the number of customers you have, the number of 5-star reviews you have, the speed with which you can deliver. Too many times, brands will round that number up. They'll talk about having 1 million customers, 1,000 5-star reviews, or we're 20% faster than the competitor. People will be suspicious of those numbers. You just give yourself a tiny little marginal gain if you turn it into 1.1 million customers, 1,050 reviews, a 21% or a 19% improvement in speed. And it's not making anything up. This isn't about being dishonest and deceitful. It's often, you're being more accurate by giving someone a precise number.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think there's a tendency to probably lean on bigger, vaguer claims like trusted by leading enterprises.
Yeah,
and just something like that, as opposed to actually going, look, we can be more specific here, and be more effective.
And the rule of thumb people often have is, if you are they're almost thinking about the self-interest of a brand. They know that people can't completely lie in advertising. So if you are a shoddy business, what you'll often do is hide behind vagueness, trusted by leading brands, because one leading brand once did something with you. But what a reliable, respected brand who've got a lot to shout about, they will be more specific because they can be more specific. They'll talk about, well, we've been trusted by Coca-Cola and Pepsi and 96 other brands. And it's this kind of screening mechanism that people over time learn. And they know that vagueness is a tactic that's mainly used by low quality businesses. Precision is something that can only be used by higher quality businesses.
Yeah.
Falsifiability is something that can only be used by higher quality businesses.
So moving on to make it social then. We talked about this one at the top of it. So is this around the myth that B2B buyers are essentially immune to social influence within that.
Yeah, so
Like we're far too rational.
I think often that's a pushback that I hear from people. Oh yeah, look, this stuff works in a pub and a supermarket. It's not going to work amongst a multi-million-pound decision. But the evidence is quite different. I mentioned very quickly earlier a study by the Behavioural Insights team amongst GPs in Australia, and they wanted to get those GPs to give out fewer antibiotics. And what they did is they sent out 5,000 plus letters, and sometimes they tried to educate those GPs, so telling them, all the dangers of antibiotic resistance. And when they did that, there was a tiny change in behaviour, so like a 3% change in behaviour, reduction in prescription rates. Other times they sent out letters which not only had that education, but they also put the line, you're prescribing more antibiotics than 85% of other doctors in the nearby area. So it was tailored to the individual prescriber. And what they found is that prescription rate went up, reduction rate went up to 12%. So you've got 3% reduction if you just try to educate, 12% reduction if you combine education with social proof. And I think that's a fascinating experiment for anyone working in the B2B area, because what it shows is even doctors, this is a profession, a category who define themselves as being evidence-based and logical. Even they are deeply, deeply influenced by what they think their peers are doing. So one of the simplest tactics you can use as a marketer is think, what do I know about my customer? And then tell that customer about how other people like them have also picked my product. And if you can create a sense of popularity amongst a like-minded audience, that is a very, very powerful way of changing behaviour.
Yeah, I mean, also is there, is there anything within B2B as well, like the complexity of the decisions that you're making and the size of the implications of what you're doing has more of an impact on this, where you actually do want to, I don't know, it's a tricky, isn't it? It's not like you're not being rational, but also the sort of not herd mentality within it, but something within there. Certainly have a question within here, but you sort of lean on the wisdom of others or a broader thing within that.
Yeah. So the interesting thing here is so this has actually been a big kind of question in behavioural science. So when behavioural economics rose to prominence, this is really a subset of behavioural science. It's the work of people like Kahneman and Tversky. There was an English economist called Ken Binmore. And he said, all these experiments that you guys are running, they'll work when people have minor purchases, like bags of crisps and cans of Coke. They won't work on really important purchases like a house or a car or a business decision. And Richard Thaler, who went on to win the Nobel Prize, he said, Ken, you've got this completely the wrong way around. When people are making small purchases, they do it so regularly, they learn their preferences. And therefore, sometimes they might behave rationally. He says, though, when they're making really big purchases, almost by definition, they do it infrequently. And because they do it infrequently, there is a degree of uncertainty. And if we know that we don't know the full picture, we are much more likely to rely on these biases, like what are other people doing? So in really big business decisions, they are often kind of unique. They're bespoke to that particular situation. There isn't a history of doing them again and again and again. And it's that uncertainty that often makes us more influenced by these biases. So I think, again, it is a myth that these principles affect smaller purchases. They are just as likely, if not more likely, to affect the largest of our purchases.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's like the age-old adage, nobody got fired for buying Microsoft, if that still exists and is still doing the rounds. But same sort of thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's an idea that we are not just trying to get the best result from a situation, I think, with that adage. We are also trying to defend our position afterwards. And if you, in a business, go off and make a really rogue decision, even if the probabilities were in your favour, if it fails, you are culpable and you might lose your job. If you pick IBM or Microsoft or Accenture for a consultant, it if you follow the crowd and that decision fails, well, you can defend yourself by saying, well, look, what I did was very sensible. All our other competitors do that. All, the industry as a whole follows that approach. So you're right. There's, I think, a double element, which is people in businesses are often thinking, if things go wrong, can I defend this? And copying the crowd is often a strong defensible position.
I read something on that recently, actually, in reference to your Accenture or other big consultancies, where they were saying, they're going to be, as is typical knee-jerk fashion on LinkedIn, consultancies are going to be no more in X amount of years' time because of AI, and it's just going to do the job for them. And somebody was saying, look, you're thinking about this from the wrong way. It comes from a defendability point of view. If you're sitting if you're on the executive board and you make a decision that doesn't go well, you can go, well, we worked with X consultancy on this. If you turn around and go, I asked AI.
Yes. Well, I completely agree with that. Yeah.
So make it timely then. To complete the set on it.
Yeah. So again, they've got a broad group of ideas. It's essentially the argument that exactly the same message can have a markedly effect dependent on when people hear it. There are all sorts of biases, like present bias. We're more affected by what's going to happen now than in the future. The peak end rule, that from experiences we tend to remember the final moment. But the bias that might be worth discussing is one that I've done a bit of experimentation on, which is this idea of temporal reframing, or pennies a day effect. And it's quite useful for anyone thinking about putting a pitch together and putting prices down. And it's the argument that exactly the same price will be viewed as more acceptable if it's broken down into smaller units. So the study I did was amongst 500 people, randomized them to 4 groups. Everyone saw the same picture of a car, description of a car, and then they got the price. And some saw it as an annual amount. And I'll change this just for the ease of maths. Let's say it was, this cost you £365 a year. Some saw a monthly amount, £30 a month, weekly amount, £7 a week, or a daily amount, £1 a day. And what we found was that when people were then asked how good value this car is, we saw a wildly different pattern. It went from 11% of people thinking the car was good value when they saw the annual amount, up to 51% think it was good value when they saw the daily amount. What's happening here is people fixate on the headline sum, the pounds. What they don't put enough emphasis on is on the unit of time. So, the more you can split out your product costs, the more acceptable they become. So if you are, leasing out 1 million cars to another company, rather than talking about that being, sorry, that's a ridiculous number, 100 cars to a company, rather than saying the total cost is £100,000, what you'd want to say is it's £17 per day per user. You break the cost down and you create a more positive emotional reaction to that price. And a theme of behavioural science is when we are faced with a situation, we tend to have a quick emotional reaction. Do we feel good or bad about it? Does this feel cheap or expensive, good value or bad value? We have that emotional reaction. And then afterwards, we use logic and rationality to justify our own feeling to ourselves. So you create that initial impression, positive impression, and then people will use their mental skills to justify that impression to themselves.
Yeah, I think the framing of money and value is so interesting. And Rory Sutherland's got this quote where he says, to an economist, price is a number, and to consumers, it's a feeling.
That's a lovely quote. I haven't heard. I follow a lot that he does, but I've not heard that one before. But I think you're right that pricing is a really good entry point if people are interested in behavioural science, because you can very quickly learn what works or what doesn't work. And the great thing is there are hundreds of experiments on prices to make exactly the same cost appear better value. So it's a wonderful place for people to immerse themselves in.
Yeah, I love it. I think it's a fascinating area, and it's something that marketing, tragically at the moment, gets pushed out of far too often. But I think if marketing get back into it, it's a massive way to make an impact on a business if you start.
Yeah, and actually, I still think even if someone else is setting the price, you've still got to communicate that number. And that's probably where most behavioural science experiments sit. Let's say you've been told the price is £365 for a year. You can still, when you communicate that, say £365 £365 a year, that's the same as £1 a day. So even if you as a marketer don't have control over the price, the communication of it is within your remit. And then there are lots of these principles you can bring to bear, and they're costless essentially. Why wouldn't you at least try working with the experimental body of evidence?
Yeah, completely agree. Listen, I think we're probably coming to a close on this. So thank you, Richard. I've loved the conversation. It's given me quite a few things to noodle over, and I'm sure everyone watching this has taken away something.
I hope so.
They can actually apply it within their day jobs.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So yeah, thanks again for joining us and sharing your thinking, and plenty to take back into the day job.
Thanks a lot, Alex.